Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, hosted by the M&A Advisor. We're delighted you could join us here today. Please submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the question box on your screen. Our presenters will answer as many as possible at the end of today's virtual interactive session. Also, if you have any technical issues, please let us know using that same chat box as well, or simply hit help on the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce today's panelists. First off, we have Amy Capellante-Wolf, who's a board member and former Chief Human Resources Officer. Amy is an accomplished human resources professional, executive coach, public speaker with leadership experience from startups to Fortune 500 enterprises. Her expertise focuses on developing high-performance teams and guiding organizations through complex and challenging business transformations, including pre-IPO, rapid growth, mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, and consolidations. Her management roles span high-tech, entertainment, and consumer goods. Amy's specialty areas include business transformation and change management, organizational design and process management, business partnerships, and total rewards. Next, I'd like to introduce Shari Yocum, Principal and People Advisory America's Transaction Leader with Ernst & Young. Shari is Principal leading Ernst & Young's People Transaction practice in the Americas. With more than 20 years of experience, Shari has successfully advised global companies on complex mergers and acquisitions, large corporate change initiatives, and HR transformations. As a practitioner of HR, Shari has spent a number of years working in HRs, COEs, and as client-facing HR leader in large technology firms. Shari is often cited in industry publications on human resources strategy and post-merger integration issues, and she speaks regularly at industry conferences and virtual events. Sanjay Kachalia, Vice President Strategic Business Development at Citrix, is a seasoned tech executive with over 20 years of experience across numerous functional areas, including corporate, business development, strategy, finance, and operations. His career spans both consumer and enterprise environments with large public and privately held companies as well. Sanjay has worked across several domains, including hardware, enterprise software, industrial software, B2B, B2C, and media telecom. Sanjay currently leads corporate development for Citrix Systems, and in this role, he oversees all M&A activity, strategic investments, OEM partnerships, and integrations. Please help me in welcoming our speakers through the chat window on your screen today. Great. So to kick it off with our first question, I know that M&A went to a grinding halt for the first 6 months of the year, and now we're really seeing a buying spree. Sanjay, can you please talk to the current competitive landscape in relation to mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, and really get into how that's evolved over the last 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you, and thanks for having me here. So certainly 2020 has been unlike any year I think that we've seen within sort of the broader transaction markets, right? I think, as you correctly pointed out, we went from sort of a spring timeframe, almost a spring moratorium on all things transaction related, as folks were very concerned and concentrating on business continuity and ensuring kind of work from home provisions. I think you started to see things thaw out sort of in the mid to late summer months, I think, as a variety of buyers, private equity, strategics, and SPACs, by the way, that have now emerged, have sort of realized the new normal, right, of deal making in this regard, right? So doing diligence, conducting management sessions via Zoom, right? And I think there's a growing acceptance of that way of sort of transacting. And so I think what you've seen in terms of manifesting itself is you've seen that sort of blossom in terms of the IPO markets open, right? You've had some very successful tech IPOs, Unity and Snowflake, right, come to mind. You've definitely seen a sort of an increase in sort of carve-outs and divestitures, and M&A activity alike has picked up, right? October alone, you had over 15 $1 billion plus prints, whereas if you think back to May of this year, you had nothing, right, of the like. So you're starting to see a pickup. I think it's, again, driven by the fact that there's a growing acceptance of this medium, right, as a norm for conducting and executing transactions. I think you're starting to see some macroeconomic factors pick up as well, right, in terms of just unemployment rates and GDP, which I think is contributing. And then, of course, obviously, pending kind of how the elections turn out, tax reform and the like could be a motivator, right, for a big push toward the end of the year coming into, the Q1 of 21.
Okay, great. And I'd like to open this up to the wider group, and maybe we could piggyback off that and speak to some of the challenges and due diligence within a remote environment.
Well, hi, I'll jump in. And again, thank you for having me, Andrew. Pleasure to be here with this esteemed group of panelists. So I would say, I think what's going on with diligence is really a microcosm of what's going on with working in remote environments, period. The lack of sort of connectivity and human touch that you tend to see working in an office environment. I mean, let's all admit it, very often decisions are made in doorways as you walk around and have conversations. That sort of casual collision has really kind of is no longer available. And so we have to find, more express ways to really get underneath the performance of a company. And that's not only looking at your P&Ls and your financial metrics, but it's also understanding key talent, the dynamics of the leadership team and how they work effectively together. The culture that can be often felt when you walk into an office place has to now be looked at through much more data-driven analytics, such as pulse surveys, such as interviews with your key executives, such as looking at external factors, such as Glassdoor or LinkedIn posts. So you have to find lots of different ways now to, I would say, scrape data more from a mechanical way versus also just the human touch and feel you might normally get when you're doing due diligence, with people in a group gathering in a room together, understanding the personal dynamics.
So let me go ahead and piggyback off of what Amy just talked about. I do think that today we're running into just a lack of trust during diligence, where before we built that trust through face-to-face interaction, we're losing that, right? So where I've really been trying to push on diligence is making sure teams are getting on camera, on video, and having that conversation versus just doing data requests back and forth. That will shorten the time frame. Otherwise, we're seeing such a longer period in due diligence just because we're, really trying to fill in with data the idea of trust.
Okay,
I think that's a great point. I think Shari and Amy, I just tag on. I think that's exactly right. In terms of, Zoom and Teams and the like, I think serve their purpose up to a certain point, and then you hit a wall, right? And there is no substitute for that in-person kickoff management meeting. And so we're sort of having to kind of make amends for that, which is challenging, right? In these times, and I think going forward as well.
Great. And building off that, Shari, how do you assess culture beyond what you see on paper? What are the examples of cultural nuances, and can you provide some from recent deals?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that for me, looking at culture during diligence, I sort of have to take a look at it from three lenses. The first is really taking that external view. Amy touched on this earlier. I think for us, it's going out and digging through the web. So web scrape and understanding what is being said, what employees are saying, what is being said about the company, how are they treating employees, what is it like to work there, are they living their values, essentially. So that's probably our first element, is looking at grabbing external data to get that view. Then it really comes into two other elements, and that's first meeting with the management team. And as Sanjay said, look, we can't be in person now as much as we'd like to. But I really think getting on the phone and spending a lot of one-on-one time, getting to know the leadership team and working with them and understanding their perspective, their views, and what's important to them. So that'll give us an understanding of the organization. And then finally, digging through the artifacts of the company. What that means is really looking at things like the engagement surveys, what they reward on, what their practices are, what their policies are. All of those three things will give us such a great insight into the culture of the company.
I'd also add, in addition to all those really important sets of data, I'd look at things like the MD&A and the compensation reporting and proxy to understand their pay practices, because very often that gives you insights into what kind of behaviors they incent and what they're disclosing, and whether or not they have some interesting sort of, triple, quadruple Lindy's that they're trying to accomplish with their executive team on incentives that may be abnormal. So those kind of things also feed into the cultural, what values they are reinforcing, what they're not reinforcing. And I think that's worth a deep dive as well.
Great. And I'd like to open it up to the wider group there to talk about some of the integration. Um, Specifically, how do you integrate in a remote environment? What's changed? Are companies integrating or staying separate from a long period? Maybe Sanjay, you can start by kicking off and discussing the right approaches.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so look, I think this is the hardest one, right? I mean, I think we've spent some time talking about sort of the upfront diligence and kind of deal execution mechanics. As we all know, kind of success or failure is really pinned on the integration of the deal, right? And you talk about an area where at least in my experience, you need to live it. You need to be there in person, right, to live it. I think this is the challenging one. And so at least what we're seeing in our experience, and anecdotally, as I talk to other sort of corp dev brethren and bankers and the like, you're seeing companies being stood up sort of separately, right, through this period, right, in the sense that they're taking companies and sort of just kind of bringing them in, right, to the fold. And kind of keeping as much of their existing processes in place, right, until there's a point at which they can start to kind of realize some joining of forces and capabilities. So I think it's in some cases it's a short-term solution, and others it may be more of a long-term plan. But I think just in order to get the deal done and kind of move it to the next phase, I think the shortest distance between 2 points in that case is to kind of stand it up and keep it separate.
Yeah, and definitely, where I think that could be a challenge down the road is if you're not upfront in what your intentions are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I see that being something that early on, really spending that time saying, look, if we are going to stand it up and just kind of hold it separate for a period of time or keep it out there, but our intent is down the road to do this, and just making that really clear and transparent with employees, that'll help build the trust, and not have them anticipate, oh, this is going to stay like this forever, so that when you come to change things, you lose everybody along the way. So I think that's really important. I do see some companies trying to integrate, but I totally agree with you, Sanjay. I think it's a huge challenge right now. You can get it done, but it takes a lot of work because again, everyone's living in their own home, working in their own siloed world. It's very hard. So I think for me, the focus on, and if you're going to try to go ahead and integrate during this time, is a high level of communication, high touch, reaching out and making sure people have the answers they need. Because it's very hard. You're not getting a large group unless you're doing it through like a conference call where you can try to get a bigger hit rate with the population. Otherwise, you're really having to do much more one-on-one conversation getting out there.
Yeah.
Great. And Amy, what should CHROs be thinking about during this time?
It's a really interesting time to be a CHRO. And I think the hard part is that we've never had this happen before. So everything's precedence. And so if you think about trying to run your business day to day with thinking about, okay, now how do I think about pay practices? Because now people are working wherever they want to work. How do I think about, time spent on PTO? I mean, all the different things and different benefit schemes you might need now in this new world. Imagine layering on top of that an acquisition or a divestiture. So back to Shari and Sanjay's point is you got to build trust with the employee population, and yet we're kind of making stuff up along as we go around policies, around how you run the business and how you integrate. So I think as a head of HR, you have to be in lockstep and perhaps a step ahead to try and project and predict what's going to happen in this new scheme of pandemic or whatever the next thing we have to bear comes across our desks, to understand what are some of the implications and long-term effects of these things. Because if you make decisions midstream and then change them down the path, you're going to erode trust, and you're also going to probably have some retention challenges because people aren't going to want to stick around a place where we're not very clear about what are the decision-making practices, what can I expect as an employee from an employee value proposition, how do I know how I'm going to be measured for performance and paid for performance. So it's a slippery slope. I think a lot of good CHROs are out in front, but I think it's going to be a continuous challenge as you think about more acquisitions or divestitures or things coming down the path, being introduced to the macro environment.
Absolutely. And those are some great points. Shari, I'm interested as we move forward, how do you see this impacting integration?
It's interesting because I actually think that, as awful as COVID is, trust me, no doubt there, but it is actually a time when employees now are more open to change than they've ever been. They expect change to be happening all the time. And so you can take full advantage of that kind of openness to change to push forward in integration. work with employees and say, look, here's what's going to happen. Here are the different changes coming up. And I think they're more willing to accept it. It's amazing. I watched one company roll out a new software product, and normally that would take months, and I watched them do it in like a week, right? The speed at which people are willing to accept change now is just amazing. So actually, I think companies could take advantage of this and really push forward on making change faster and getting employees more comfortable with it. So from an integration perspective, this could be a good thing in terms of that change element. But I think, again, the collaborative tools that you deploy with it are going to be very important. You've got to find ways to make sure you're fully connected to the population so they understand what the changes are. And again, always going back to kind of the heart of M&A, which is people have to know first what it means to them. So I always go back to, look, if you want to do anything, you first have to be really clear on what does it mean to them. Do they have a job? What is changing? Does their pay change? I mean, all of these, especially in this very sensitive environment, you have to focus on that first. Then you can actually push forward with things like what's changing about your job, what's changing about the company, and so forth. But I do think you have to still remember the basics that are really key.
Absolutely. And Sanjay, are you seeing deals being announced faster relative to any of this?
It's. I think the answer is it really depends, right? I think you've seen some M&A activity this year driven by the fact that companies have had a prior relationship, right, with the target, either in the way of a partnership or a strategic investment, which I think has just accelerated the diligence, right? And that they've gotten to know the company, they've courted the company, they've been a board observer, what have you. And so I think that's kind of led to some deals being announced faster, right? Again, both sides just getting comfortable with diligence. I think in a situation where that's not the case, right? You're kind of starting greenfield. I think deals are kind of taking their sort of normal pace, kind of whatever that means, right? But I think the difference, at least from what we're seeing and from the conversations that we're having, is that you're having both sides really focus on sort of a set number of issues that really, really matter, right? In terms of risk allocation, red flags, and the like. And so I think that's been sort of the difference that we've noticed, right, in this sort of COVID period of really taking sort of a laundry list of a diligence request and kind of boiling it down to that discrete set of items that's really going to impact deal value in one direction or another.
Okay, great. And I'd like to open this up to the collective group a bit and ask you to take out your crystal balls. We're all wondering, is there a silver lining for deal making post-COVID and what you're seeing around that?
Yeah, I'll throw a couple things out there. One thing I've noticed is just how efficient we've become and or had to become, I should say. But when it comes to, like we talked about earlier, just due diligence, getting really more focused on, you just mentioned that's the key, focusing on those higher priority items. And then really kind of pushing forward on integration and trying to move faster in some areas where we can, or holding off and being clear about what we're doing. But I do think the efficiency, because we're having to work through the phone on so much of it, has gotten better. I think the way that we are, the tools and things that we're developing right now have become pretty amazing. And I think some of those going forward, and I'll give an example. So we do a session where we call it kind of walk the wall. The idea is, as we prepare for day one, we go through every activity. We've always done this in a large room with a ton of people, and it's a huge event. But we've had to now do this online, and it has been amazing, actually. I think it's a practice that I'd like to continue moving forward, because we are able to connect all parts of the world together over the phone and be very efficient and effective, but leveraging new tools to be able to work together remotely doing this. And so those are some practices I think will continue going forward.
Yeah, I'll add in my perspective, and I've worked with Shari in the past, and the Walk the Walls is an amazingly productive cross-collaboration, cross-organizational exercise to make certain you're understanding downstream and upstream impacts. And so I'm heartened to hear that we can still do that, maybe in a less monolithic way and more in an agile as you need way. I would say, just predicting what's happening in 2021, of course, I don't have a crystal ball. We have to see how the elections ultimately play out. But I anticipate there's going to be a lot of winners and losers based on their business models and how those business models have either been impacted positively or negatively because of COVID. So if you're on a communications platform, if you're on something that people actually need to be doing their work from a business process perspective, you're probably going to see some consolidation and roll-ups in that space, because there's some who've really accelerated there and others that haven't. I think, too, you might see some PE firms that have been invested in firms long term. Some they want to go spin or IPO those firms, and I think some of those are going to start to hit in Q1 and Q2. And you just might see some consolidation within some of the spaces, such as I come out of cybersecurity, and I still see there's lots of roll up happening there. There's a lot of ankle biters that have real, install base around a particular technology. But if you're looking for someone to do the end to end, there's an opportunity to consolidate and bring all that together. So I think, as crazy as 2020 was, I think 2021 is going to be even more interesting based off of the political outlook and the economic outlook. But I do think there's an opportunity for more rapid M&A or consolidations happening in the market.
Yeah, and I tag on and echo Shari and Amy's sentiments. I think 2021. Of course, I'm the corp dev guy here, so I've got to be bullish on M&A sentiments. But I do think what you're seeing is a lot of cash on the sidelines in the way of private equities and strategics, and you're also seeing stock, I think, reemerge as a very viable consideration. You just had AMD announce its $35 billion deal of Xilinx with 100% stock. So you're seeing companies that have run up over the past couple of years using those gains, right, strategically in terms of charting future growth. So I think what you're going to see is sort of a continuation of deal activity on the part of SPACs, on the part of private equity firms. I think the IPO markets are going to continue to remain open for tier one assets. And then I think you're going to have some strategics, some of the larger strategics that have been sort of sitting on the sidelines for the last year, 18 months, maybe replotting their game boards in terms of the way they want to go to market, execute blockbuster deals. So I think you'll start to see kind of, a few AMD Xilinx-like deals come into the fray in 2021, of course, pending macroeconomic climate, the results of the election, and the like.
Yeah, and to kind of carry on with that, I do think that as you look at these companies coming together, they're reassessing their portfolio, as you mentioned, and you'll see not only just the buying side, but a lot of that carving out and divesting of business so they can free up additional cash and resources to be able to put other areas. So I think the two together is just going to make a really interesting 2021.
Yep.
Well, and Sanjay, you mentioned SPACs. I think that's really an interesting area because we're seeing so much activity there in the market. And really, this is taking private companies public very quickly, right? Immediately. And so from the HR perspective, the thing I'm running into often with companies and spending time in is how do you get ready to be a public company so quickly, right? Everything from getting all of the compensation elements ready, the compliance issues. I mean, there's just so much work going into this in such a short time frame. It's just flipping a business from being private to public almost immediately. We're definitely seeing a huge amount of activity there, and I would expect that to continue possibly going forward.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Shari. I mean, I think it's a very interesting buyer, right, that's emerged in 2020, right? It's almost the year of the SPAC, where you have these sort of blank check companies that are going out, to Shari's point, taking companies public, using sort of funds that they raise in the public markets to then go do further acquisitions. And I think what's interesting is that in conversations that I'm having externally with bankers, private equity firms, and the like, it's interesting to note that whereas we used to have these conversations in a competitive process where you talk about interlopers being potentially another strategic or a private equity firm, in the recent conversations that I've been having, SPACs have been more emphasized, right, as potential interlopers and serious bidders that you would have to consider for, again, prized assets.
And if I can just add one thing from an employee perspective, having worked in large market, mid-market public companies, I did take a company public in 2009, and it was a 4-year slog going to an IPO. But the interesting thing for me was the mindset of an employee who works in a private company versus a public company. Because very often those who are in pre-IPO like the innovation, the sort of sloppiness you're going towards to try and go public. And then once they get through that big milestone, they don't want to stick around and want to go to their next private gig, so to speak, or their next pre-IPO gig. So the whole persona of what you might have as an employee pre-IPO versus post is different. The mindset, perhaps the profile of the employee. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see these companies that go public through a SPAC and what that means in terms of tumult or turmoil with the employee population about who stays and who goes.
And it's funny, you said 4 years. I'm watching these companies go within months. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Exactly. A huge change.
Okay, great. So we're going to be moving on to our question and answer segment. We have a great list of questions that we're really excited to run through. But again, if you have not submitted a question and wish to do so, please do so now. Great. And for our first question, can you please share your experiences with workforce economics, impacts, and levers? And we could kick things off with either Shari or Amy.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start a little bit and then hand it over to Amy. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I know I'm going in and out here a little bit. Yeah, I think that a lot of companies really already started using their levers for their kind of early stage, looking at how to cut costs. So I think right after COVID, you saw that first wave of furloughs and restructuring, and now companies are really getting that stage to look at, okay, do we do something bigger, either carve out, divest, as we discussed earlier, or just general layoffs as they're acquiring companies. So I think there's a number of factors I see companies, kind of number of levers I see companies pulling because of the workforce economics right now, mostly around restructuring and furloughs. But those are really starting to stop a bit. I think with Pfizer coming out recently, that's actually such a big change. I think there's sort of hope now, light at the end of the tunnel, and we actually maybe see a timeline where we're going to see changes. So it'll be interesting to see how this impacts the next few months in terms of what companies decide to do.
Thanks for that, Shari. I'd also add a different flavor too. Is I sit on a couple of private boards, and we've been having discussions around the short-term incentive plans that you are going through as part of your fiscal year. And a lot of these companies are giving grace. They're looking at the performance of the company and realizing some of these targets that they were hoping to hit probably aren't going to be attained because of COVID. So as opposed to being brutal around thresholds, around bonus performance, they're giving them some grace to maybe be able to earn some of that by lowering the thresholds. And sometimes you have to do a little bit of self-funding around that. But I think as you think about what's happening in the business right now, I think some of the companies want to look at retention beyond this COVID challenge that we face ourselves. So I'm excited to see that, because it's so easy to go down the other path of, hey, we're all going to suffer from COVID, but you got to try to find a way to kind of shore up some of the employees. So that's a different lever. That's more of a cost additive lever, but I think it's something that a lot of companies are thinking about right now.
I agree.
Okay, great. And can the group also share what constitutes the new normal for the employee experience during the deal? Maybe explain some of the examples or best practices.
Yeah, actually, I've had good feedback on this. We've talked a lot. I just did a forum with a large group of folks in Silicon Valley talking about the employee experience that they've set up for employees. And everyone has really adopted a number of new tools to make it much more collaborative and interactive. And that's really, I think, kind of lifting the overall game as we go forward. I'm assuming we'll take many of these same practices into future deals, but really finding ways to make it more engaging and interesting when we do our day one activities, when we are communicating with employees, getting away from just email communication, using tools like Slack and others to make that more interactive feedback, even able to now watch employee sentiment through tools like Slack and others. So you can actually watch the tone of the workforce over time to understand if the morale is going down or kind of lifting up. So there's a number of things I think that's forced us to really look at the way we're doing business. And I think we'll actually be better in the long run and will be adopted as the new norm.
Yeah, I would just add, Sherry, you bring up several good points. I think, look, in terms of sort of the new normal, I think you're kind of looking at it and experiencing it firsthand, right? I mean, this is the way I think a fair number of deals are going to get done. I think with the flurry of activity that we've had, right, over the last 90 to 120 days, I think deal makers are coming together alike and realizing that it is possible to execute transactions in sort of this virtual environment. I also think what becomes interesting, though, is that sort of day one experience, post the deal being announced, post the deal closing, where typically you're on site. It's a big sort of event, right, for an acquired company, and now with workforces getting distributed, right, and kind of remote work becoming part of the new norm, you wonder how some of those day one activities are going to have some of the same impact that they had pre-COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's really a generational issue as well, right? So what we're still trying to do is we're taking, honestly, probably most of our generation here on the phone, our generation, and applying it to this new environment, right? Trying to make it work. But if you look at generations probably 2 layers down, right? They're actually completely comfortable in this digital world. They interact seamlessly. If you watch, just a good example, if you watch kids on gaming, right? The level of interaction, the never a need to be in person. So a lot of what we're learning now is really what is going to be applied in the future. And we have to, instead of quit applying what we've always done and applying it to that virtual world, actually just rethink what we're doing. So I do think we're just seeing the very early stage of what's to come in the future. It's just moving much faster than we've ever imagined, being forced into this environment under the pandemic. I think it's interesting. I think as we go forward, you'll have a reduced need to travel on site, be in person for these day one
Mhm.
activities. But I agree, for now, I work with a lot of CEOs and leaders that are struggling through this because they cannot stand the idea of not being in front of employees in person. And so it's definitely one we're working through.
And I have two real quick points to add on that front. So one, I have worked in my career with CEOs and leadership teams who feel like if you're at home and not in the office, you're probably watching Netflix or taking care of your kids. And so that whole thing's been thrown out because no one's working in the office right now. So I think this whole mindset about how you get work done is really shifting. And then two, I think in addition to using the technology around Slack, I also think companies are going to get better in general around onboarding. Like some of the companies I work for, we're not investing in like something like a DocuSign or some way to push information before day one the employee begins to make their whole paperwork, their whole sort of orientation super easy, and it became very manual. Everything from as tactical as I-9s, things that we just take for granted that you just do when someone comes into the office. So I think there's going to be, and I'm not giving any sort of financial forecast. I do not serve on any of these advisory boards or boards, but I think companies that have ways to expedite the process of onboarding are going to get a lot of good business because you don't have someone sitting in the office waiting to sign people's documents any longer. I know that sounds antiquated, but it still exists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah. And during that question, we had two follow-ups. I think we touched on them a little bit during, but I just wanted to acknowledge them both in case there's any other points that we want to add on here. So the first one was, what are some of the takeaways from COVID-19 to consider in future corporate transactions? And the other follow-up was, what are some of the new ways of operating to adapt to the environment and virtual world? So I know we just touched on that, but any other points that maybe we want to make there?
Yeah, I'll add just something that we're doing. We really are trying to make sure that we look at this from many different perspectives when you're communicating. So trying not to just use one means. And I think this is important. So in this virtual world, thinking about it, that employees are getting data many different ways. And we probably all feel this, right? Some of us are text people, some are email, some are video. So what we have to do is assume that there is no one way. And so in this world, we have to find multiple ways of saying the same message over and over again. I can't emphasize the high level of need of communication and bringing teams together to have that. Unfortunately, I feel like the one thing we're lacking these days is just that pick up the phone call and talk, sort of to replace the water cooler conversation. We just don't have that enough. So I think the more we can do that, it's important. But I do think that multiple messages, multiple times is just, it needs to occur over and over. And this actually starts as early as the deal process. So as we're sitting in the room or on the phone call with the legal teams and the corp dev team and all the functional teams, we need to have much more interaction and conversations, because I feel like one thing that's slowing down deals right now is when we get to this back and forth on data, right? We don't get back to the conversation like, why are we really asking for this? What are we really trying to get to? And we get into this dreadful cycle of attorneys going back and forth. So if anything we can do,
It's never a good thing.
That's never a good thing.
Agreed. Agreed.
But that is it. Like, I feel like we have to get back to that conversation and get people talking face to face, and it really does make a difference, even if it's over video like this.
I think that's right. I think that's right, Shari. I would add to that. I think, based on the questions, the follow-up questions, I think what you're seeing and what I hope to see at least is efficiency, right? That comes out of sort of this COVID process, kind of across the board, right? In the way we do deals, in the issues that we focus on, in the diligence, right, that we undertake. And Shari, even to your point, right, as we start to exchange comments on definitive documents and the like. So I hope there is a stream of efficiency that comes out of it. And Amy, to the point that you brought up just now, I mean, think about it. Would you have, ever thought that sort of, in March or even a year ago at this time, we'd be able to kind of onboard employees virtually, right? Or executives for that matter, right? And we all know people are changing jobs in the era of COVID. They're changing jobs. They're getting what they need to get, right, to be successful in their new environments. And they're doing it for the most part without even being on site or around their hiring manager or around their colleagues. So it's happening. I think it's stress testing, Amy, to the point that you brought up, these antiquated ways that we thought about and we thought would be sort of the normal going forward. And I think they're pushing us in new, hopefully more efficient directions.
Yeah, and let me add, there are some tactical things that we're running into. The fact that employees are not working in their home location and these cause tax issues. I mean, there's kind of this new world during COVID that we have to be careful of that is causing challenges. So I think as you kind of start working with the workforce, understanding what, kind of new to the process would be understanding any of the benefits that were taken as part of the CARES Act. So as you're doing diligence, that's sort of a new thing we've had to look at because of COVID. And then, of course, understanding, just as you're working with each of the teams, where those employees are actually really sitting. So when you're putting employment contracts and other things in place, we're understanding where are they being taxed, where are they actually located. Those are potential liabilities. So there were these unique things that have come out of COVID along the way that impact deals.
And I also wonder, just to that point, having worked with more works councils than I'd like to, there are ones in particular like Germany that are super hard around data privacy as well as the UK, but around just even getting technology tools into the employees' hands for us to be able to be more productive, and just the amount of work you have to go with their technology committees. And so I think we're going to have to also look at sort of just governance in general and how they're going to have to lighten up a bit or find ways to be more accepting, because otherwise you'll never get a deal transacted if we go through the same process we've gone in the past and the length of time it takes to get these things approved. So I think everyone's going to have to really adjust and adapt pretty quickly to this.
I agree.
Okay, great. We're going to be moving on to the final question that we have in our queue here. So if any of our attendees have any other questions, please do enter that in the chat window now. And our final question currently is, can you tell us what about the primary challenges that affect human capital during COVID and give an example of what you have seen? So I think, again, curtailing off that and any additional points we'd like to raise here.
I'll kick off on that. And of course, want to hear from Shari and Sanjay. But I think the biggest part is how do you continue to have people feel like they're connected? Because everyone's on Zoom 24 hours a day. So you'd imagine they feel like they are connected, but they're transactional. And it's very, it's very much about, driving for performance. And I think a lot of companies aren't going to go back to their offices. I mean, it's startling. I'm really amazed to be watching what's going to happen with all this real estate and all these offices that we have that are suddenly vacant, and what it means from a CapEx perspective from these, or OpEx perspective from these businesses. But I think the hardest thing is going to be, how do you make certain people are feeling included, that they are a part of a larger fabric? And back to Shari's points, lots of communication, lots of alignment. And the market moves so fast, you got to find a way to connect the employee fast enough so they can get realigned to what their priorities are as things shift and change every day. So I think it's an employee engagement story and a strategy alignment story. I think that it's really going to make this challenging.
Yeah, and I think the one thing to add to that is trust as well. Trust has been still hard to build over, again, it's funny, I've noticed that when I take off video now and I'm doing just a phone call, I've become so used to video that I'm at a loss almost to understand, like, what are they really thinking? What's the real, what is the demeanor, the behaviors that you're seeing? So video is that first step in building trust, but trust is going to be so critical to making employees feel comfortable. I would expect still, but we're going to continue to see restructuring and layoffs, which is going to erode the trust even further. So as these deals come about, everything that we can do to build trust in the workforce, and I always try to focus on their leadership team because they trust their current leaders to try to drive those activities and that communication to make employees feel comfortable. So I do think that's a big one going forward, is the trust.
Great. Yeah.
I think candidly, that's the biggest challenge in my day-to-day that I'm facing right now, right? Is in the past, sharing Amy's points, I think trust is one of the most important thing, if not the most important thing when you're courting. And the ability to do that in person as you're breaking bread, what have you, sort of the old school way, if you will, that wasn't so old school about 8 months ago, is something that has been lost, right, in the ensuing months. And so I found that to be the most challenging thing is how do you build trust over Zoom on a phone call? It's incredibly challenging. And while we're starting to see life, at least here in the Bay Area, people getting out and starting to meet, it's very mixed, right? And for every sort of exec or banker or VC or what have you that is comfortable, there are equal numbers of people that are not yet comfortable, right? So I think that is going to be a challenge going forward with the balance of this year and certainly into 2021.
Yeah, and I would probably add one thing to that also. You mentioned trust and that things are coming up in this remote environment. Let me just add, I also am curious to see how companies handle the concerns that employees express when they don't want to come back to the office.
Yeah.
So they've been able to do a job very effectively somewhere else. And why? What's going to force them to come back? And how do you decide? How do you force employees to do that, right? So there's going to be this really interesting trend where people have gotten very used to working from home or having this huge amount of flexibility that now as we kind of pull it back into the office or even think about going back to like an 8 to 5, right? Because many of us have been working these, whenever you're working, right? Kind of whatever time zone's needed to get work done. So I think that'll be interesting as well as we kind of pull back.
Great. Well, that's all the questions that we have for today. For any of our attendees viewing this webinar through the on-demand, if you have any questions, you could reply to the email you got with the login instructions, and we'll forward that down for you. But thanks again to our speakers, Amy, Shari, and Sanjay, for taking the time to present our session today, as well as all of our sponsors for making all of this possible. We hope you found today's session informative and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar hosted by the M&A Advisor. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.